Good afternoon, and welcome to our conversation today on LTE and license and its coexistence with Wi-Fi. Today we're talking to Puneet Sethi, a Director of Product Management at Qualcomm Atheros. Puneet, thank you for being us today. Okay, to get started, can you tell us what prompted Qualcomm to get into LTE and license? LTE is a technology based on licensed spectrum, and so this is quite an interesting move towards a new type of spectrum utilization. What motivated that?
Sure. So Monica, you know about the 1000X challenge. That's something that began almost 3 years back. So the LTU came out of that initiative, that umbrella, and several other as did several other things. So you go back 3 years, we started this initiative to drive solutions from within Qualcomm and also across the industry to meet the challenges of exponential growth in data demand, which was almost doubling every year. So you really needed some innovative solutions to meet that kind of challenge. Several solutions under the 1000X challenge initiative were brought from conception to commercialization. That included hyperdense small cell networks, ultrasound solution for inside to out coverage, license shared access, and other solutions. And now LTE unlicensed is part of that tool set as well, which allows operators to pair unlicensed spectrum with their licensed anchor and deliver higher throughput and better user experience to their subscribers.
Yes, and I understand that all these efforts are progressing in parallel. But what is the advantage that specifically LTE license brings when you can already use the 5 gigahertz band with Wi-Fi? So what is the value proposition for a mobile operator?
Yes, you're correct. Wi-Fi has been there in 5 gigahertz and also previous to that in 2.4. So before we get into that, let me just say that both LTE and Wi-Fi, both radio technologies have been there for quite some time, have seen multiple years of evolution, and will continue to evolve, and will be there to meet the different set of use cases that we see out there in the real world, including diverse set of devices, diverse mix of application and QoS requirements. LTE and unlicensed spectrum, that brings certain set of unique advantages to operators that have already deployed LTE network to provide additional capacity by leveraging unlicensed spectrum paired with a licensed anchor and delivering higher throughput, as I mentioned earlier. Additionally, it enables them to spread the capital expenditure on core network across both licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So it's more efficient use of the investment that they've made in the core network. It also enables them to use the same security, mobility, and signaling framework that comes and is core to the LTE protocol itself across both licensed and unlicensed spectrum, thereby enabling seamless mobility to their subscribers.
Mm-hmm. So LTE license fits better with the mobile operator network. But if we look at it from the other point of view, the point of view of the user, will they notice a difference? Does it make any difference to them if they connect through Wi-Fi or LTE unlicensed?
Well, so I think both, like I said, it really depends on the use case and the requirement. And there are different set of users out there, including enterprise and residential users. So for local area use case, I think Wi-Fi has been there and has been serving that market well. For use cases that require increased mobility and the stability of a licensed anchor, where you have a licensed anchor that you can rely on for control and signaling, that's where I think LTE unlicensed provides certain benefits. It enables LTE also inherently is spectrally more efficient. For the same amount of spectrum, it can deliver 2x more capacity, and it's also works better alongside Wi-Fi. If what we say is it's a better neighbor to Wi-Fi than Wi-Fi is it to itself. So if you have two Wi-Fi nodes right next to each other and replace one of them with LTE unlicensed, not only would you see the gains from the LTE unlicensed node, but also you will see the improvement on in the neighboring Wi-Fi performance. Mm-hmm. So again, I think the sets of technologies are very complementary, and depending on the use case and the requirements, it'd be either one or the other would meet needs of the subscriber.
Yeah, and I guess that if you can pack more throughput, more capacity within the band, that's an event to the collective advantage of everybody involved, service provider, enterprise, and subscriber. But another important stakeholder here is the enterprise, because a lot of Wi-Fi networks are owned and managed by the enterprise, large venues, and they own their Wi-Fi networks, and they're going to be very protective about them, and they want to control as much as they can the band. What are you seeing in terms of reaction there, in terms of from the enterprise?
So enterprise again represent a very unique set of subscriber with their unique requirement. So I think with today's enterprise environment where mobility is key, you have they're becoming increasingly mobile. Their employees move across enterprises in and out of buildings and within the enterprise building itself. So LTE Unlicensed provide those satisfies those requirements, because mobility is, as I said, is inherent to the LTE technology itself. So if you pair unlicensed spectrum with a licensed anchor, you get the mobility, and you're also able to meet the coverage and capacity needs for enterprises. And the challenge there usually is typically around indoor coverage, which is where I think LTE unlicensed is more relevant, because this technology is more applicable to small cells because of higher frequency band that's used in these in the LTE product. So you're able to deploy those small cells inside the buildings for indoor coverage and capacity.
Mm-hmm. So the enterprise gains better indoor coverage as well.
Yes.
With yes, but you mentioned the fact that these technologies have to coexist, but there's just so much spectrum out there. So you need to find a good way to allocate spectrum resources to do both technologies. And the term it is you always use is nice. So the technologies need to be nice to each other. But what does nice mean? What does it take for a technology to be nice to the other?
Well, at the basic level, it really means that the radio technology is able to detect the presence of other users of the transmission medium, and then thereby adapts its own behavior and shares the medium with the other users of the transmission medium. And it's and there are ways to ensure that, and that's what I think your second part of the question, that how do you ensure that they're nice to each other. So there are different layers to that. The first layer is the regulatory side. So there are regulations in every country as to how to utilize the unlicensed spectrum, which those regulations may define spectrum mask, transmit power, and other requirements. So every radio technology has to comply with that. And again, there are certain differences as you go from one country to another in terms of regulations that apply to the unlicensed spectrum. For example, if you look at Europe and Japan and some of the other markets where you have what we call as listen before talk requirement, or LBT requirement, that forces certain requirements on the waveform to be able to meet those regulatory requirements of listen before talk. And then there are other countries, US, South Korea, and China, where you don't have those requirements, and those are the non-LBT regions. So regardless of whether it's LBT region or non-LBT regions, the first layer is that you have to meet the radio technology has to comply with the regulatory requirements. And then but that is not enough from the perspective of being nice, or as you said, standardizing coexistence procedures. So you have to go beyond the regulatory requirements and actually define and standardize coexistence procedures that define how technologies coexist. And that requires industry consensus. For the LBT regions, that work is happening in 3GPP, where LTE Unlicensed is a Release 13 study item supported by various operators and infrastructure vendors. For non-LBT regions, you have the opportunity to use the existing Release 10, Release 11, 12 LTE waveform with use of adaptive duty cycle mechanism, which we call CSAT, to ensure coexistence. And that has also been standardized. LTU Forum, as you know, published specs that are now publicly available for everybody to review and see what coexistence procedures and test specs have been defined for that space.
Yeah, well, right. And so there is a lot of ongoing work right now. There's a lot of activity on the standardization side, and as you say, we need to have a industry consensus. How close are we to get to that consensus, given that there are not everybody has the same goals? So there is, how close are we to find a solution that makes everybody reasonably happy?
I think we are pretty close. Fortunately, for LTE unlicensed, that has seen a lot of industry support. There's a lot of ecosystem support building for this technology. For non-LB for LBT regions, if you look at them first, that work is going in 3GPP. So that work is supported by the major operators and infrastructure vendors, and that is taking its course and is going to be part of Release 13 discussions as they play out within the 3GPP. For non-LBT regions such as US, LTE Forum published the specs, so that was a work that was done over the past several months by leading operators, including Verizon and infrastructure vendors such as Ericsson, and Qualcomm was also the founding member of that forum. So that work has now resulted in these coexistence specs that are available for anybody to review. So if somebody wants to create an LTU product, they can look at the specs and see what coexistence procedures they have to implement and what kind of test they would have to pass. Now the work ahead in those regions is now to take those specs and drive those products, first generation LTE unlicensed products, into those markets. Mm-hmm. So I think, in short, we're pretty close. There's a lot of ecosystem momentum behind LTE unlicensed.
Yeah, and I guess everybody realizes that everybody has to be nice to each other. So that's the best way forward. And for most vendors, there is both a Wi-Fi component and an LTE component within their own business, and so they have to, they have to manage both. So that there is no choice between the two of them. And Qualcomm is one of them because you guys have both a Wi-Fi business and LTE business. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's how I mean, as I said in the beginning, both technologies have been there around for some time. We've been part of the evolution as these technologies have evolved. So I was, a few weeks back, I was at an event up in Bay Area with our WIN team, which is responsible for the Wi-Fi infrastructure. So organizationally, small cells fits closely with the Wi-Fi infrastructure team as well. So we were all in the same room, sort of brainstorming future generation products for both LTE unlicensed and Wi-Fi. And as you have seen, even on the Wi-Fi side, we have drove the leadership in Wi-Fi 11 AC Wave 2 multi-user MIMO features. So we're sort of the leaders in that space as well, and we're driving that evolution further with 11AX and however the Wi-Fi technology will evolve going forward. And similarly for LTE unlicensed, we're working for the LBT regions. We're working in 3GPP, supporting the industry in the 3GPP discussions. For non-LBT regions, we're now working on our productization plans based on the LTU specs. So I guess in short, as I mentioned earlier, both the technologies are here to stay. They're going to be required to meet the diverse set of use cases and devices and applications. So we just want to make sure we drive both technologies really hard and have best-in-class solutions there in both sides, so that whatever our customers end up selecting based on their own requirements, we would have something to offer to them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so there is a lot of work that you're doing on the sort of moving forward the technology in terms of thought leadership, development. But if a mobile operator comes to you and say, "Well, we're interested in LTE unlicensed," how can you specifically help them? How can you help them move towards deploying the technology?
So we announced earlier this year support for a non-LBT region, support for both small cell in our small cell products and on the UE products. So we're driving those products towards commercialization and early trials later this year. So that's the way we're going to help mobile operators in the non-LBT regions to get to prioritization products in the field faster. Various North American operators have already expressed support for LTE unlicensed trial, and we're working with them. For the LBT regions, we will continue to work with the industry and within the 3GPP forum to drive that technology through the standards. And then as and when standards firm up, we're going to drive the technology through our product plans, both on the small cells and on the UE side.
Now, if a mobile operator wants to, they want to deploy LTE unlicensed today in the US or in a non-LBT region, what is their path to upgrade in terms of being able to then move to LAA LTE if they decide to do that?
So the answer to that would depend on several factors, including what sort of investments mobile operator would have already made in LTE unlicensed or is going to make. There's a lot of architectural details that we'd have to get into there. But in short, the platforms that we're looking at features such as that would enable software upgradability from along the LTE unlicensed track. So that enables operator to upgrade from one phase of LTE unlicensed to another phase, depending on the product architecture, of course, and also on the depending on the core network architecture as well.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on what the standards will be, but
yes, exactly.
They will have to move forward.
Yeah, so there are some moving parts there too, as in the standards are not set, so a lot would depend on what actually comes out of 3GPP.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, one crucial element to determine the success of LTE unlicensed is in the handset, because you need to have handsets that support it. You need to have device vendors that will make those handsets and subscribers that eventually buy them. What are you doing in that area specifically?
On the handset, we announced our WTR3950, which was a companion chip that supports the 5 gigahertz band. So that would be commercially available later this year. So that's part of the the LTE unlicensed support on the handset side. And again, for the LBT regions, the plans we would have plans of prioritization plans as and when 3GPP standard sort of firm up on the LTE LAA specs. So there is work being done both on the handset and on the small cell side to drive these solutions to market, both for LBT and non-LBT regions.
So what are you doing specifically on the small cell side for LTE unlicensed?
On the small cell side, well, we already have commercially available FSM V3 or FSM 9955 solution. So what we're able to do is we're able to software upgrade that solution to support LTE unlicensed, and then we pair that solution, that baseband solution, with our new RFIC FTR 8950 for support, and that will support the 5 gigahertz band with FTR 8950. So both of those solutions would line up with the UE availability with later half of 2015.
Can you give a little bit of a sense of how difficult it is and how expensive it is to add LTE unlicensed to the current devices and small cells? Because I guess if it's just a software upgrade, it shouldn't really be too difficult on the small cell side. What about the handsets?
So there are different aspects to that, Monica. The aspect is, so one is the product cost, which is, I guess, goes, you really need to add 5 gigahertz band support to the product. So that would be the additional cost from a product cost perspective. And then additionally, LTE unlicensed, depending on how operator decides to deploy this, may require some software upgrades to other elements of the network as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so now in terms of timeline, because so one issue is that will the devices will be available, and usually the following question is when, because if you have the infrastructure, usually the infrastructure goes first, but you need the devices. In terms of timeline, what should we expect?
So we're targeting our solutions, our chipset solutions for both small cells and handset to later half of this year, and expect with commercial solutions, 3 to 6 months after that, depending on the OEM and trial schedules.
Yeah, so it's not today, but pretty close. Now,
Yes.
another line I guess it's within the 1000x vision is the use of the 3.5 band, and Qualcomm has been very vocal for quite a long time on using that to increase capacity. How does that relate to LTE on license? Is it in addition to that, or if you have LTE on license, well, then you might not need 3.5?
I think it complements really well the LTE unlicensed model. And 5 gigahertz, which is where LTE unlicensed initial focus is. LTE in 5 gigahertz is a sort of a global band that's available globally. 3.5 is different, has different regulations depending on the country. Outside of U.S. and in some markets, Europe and Japan, it's mainly a licensed band. So for those markets, it really becomes licensed LTE in 3.5 gigahertz. In U.S., the FCC is still working on how to, under regulations. There are proposals on the table around a tiered approach. So depending on how those what finally comes out of that, we could potentially see LTE unlicensed deployment in 3.5 as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let me ask you a final question. What should we expect in the next year or two in terms of what are the priorities? What needs to be done to make sure that LTE unlicensed succeeds? What are the major challenges out there?
So the work ahead of us is for the LBT regions. I think the big chunk of work that's ahead of the industry is to drive the item through 3GPP through the 3GPP process, study item and the work item. And there's a lot of support there, a lot of operators, infrastructure, equipment manufacturers, mobile phone manufacturers, chip silicon manufacturers are working on this together. So we got to make sure that gets standardized through 3GPP release 13. For the non-LBT regions, the specs are already out there, for everybody's review and feedback. Now we have to take those specs and implement products and drive those products through early trials and then launch in early part of next year.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So it sounds like there is a very hectic schedule ahead of the industry right now on this. Well, Puneet, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Monica.